The snow whispered under Eli's boots as he hauled an armload firewood into the cabin. His breath clouded the freezing air, a sharp reminder of winter's chokehold on this corner of Montana. The cabin sat at the edge of a frozen meadow, surrounded by towering pines that swayed under the weight of the storm's remnants. It was quiet now. Too quiet, Eli thought. He dropped the bundle of wood near the stove and cast another wary glance out the frost-rimmed window. The woods stared back at him, dark and impenetrable. Nothing moved but the drifting flakes that fell lazily from the branches. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching. Shaking off the thought, he poured himself a cup of black coffee, but his hand lingered near the rifle propped against the wall. He'd hunted enough to know the forest's sounds, its patterns, its moods. Lately, though, something had been off. It had started 2 weeks ago with faint tracks near the riverbank. Too big for a coyote, too heavy for a lynx. A mountain lion, he'd decided. He'd seen them before, but not this close to the cabin. At first he dismissed it as the natural order of things. The woods belonged to them as much as they did to him. But then came the claw marks. 4 deep gouges etched into the bark of a pine tree, fresh enough that sap still wept from the wounds. Something about those marks felt deliberate. Eli began to notice other things too. Nights became restless, punctuated by faint scratching at the cabin walls and howling in the distance. He would fling the door open, shotgun in hand, but the clearing always stood empty. The traps he set near the tree line had been disturbed, bait taken, metal mangled as though crushed by something powerful. A rabbit he'd caught was missing, dragged into the woods, leaving a faint trail of blood in the snow. The snow crunched underfoot as Eli followed the faint trail from the broken trap into the woods. The tracks grew clearer as he moved deeper into the forest, their size confirming his suspicions. It was a lion, and it was big, bigger than any he'd seen in these parts. The claw marks on nearby trees grew fresher, the sap glistening in the morning light. By the time he returned, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting the clearing in deep blue shadows. Eli spent the evening barricading the windows and doors, stacking furniture against the walls and keeping the rifle within arm's reach. He sat by the fire, his shadow flickering on the log walls as he listened for any sound beyond the crackle of the flames. It came near midnight, a soft scratching at the far side of the cabin, faint but deliberate. Eli froze, his pulse hammering in his ears. The scratching grew louder, more insistent. His hands shook as he grabbed the rifle, extinguished the lantern, and crept toward the door. The sound stopped. The silence pressed in, thick and suffocating. Then a low growl reverberated through the cabin walls. Eli threw the door open, aiming into the darkness. The clearing stood empty, the snow unbroken. He fired into the night, the rifle's echo splitting the silence. When the noise faded, there was only stillness. The scratching didn't come again that night, but Eli didn't sleep. In the days that followed, his unease grew. He ventured deeper into the woods, following fresh tracks that wound through the trees before vanishing abruptly at the edge of a steep ravine. The tracks didn't lead away from the edge, they simply stopped. Eli stared down into the jagged rocks below, his mind spinning. It was here, he thought, but where did it go? As he retraced his steps, images began to flicker through his mind. Fragmented memories that didn't add up. The broken trap, his own hands gripping the metal, twisting it apart. The missing rabbit, the faint scent of broth. He remembered the knife, the pot simmering over the fire. The claw marks, the axe in his hands, swinging against the bark in a fit of rage. The tracks, his boots, the looping, erratic pattern in the snow. Eli sank to his knees in the clearing, his breath fogging in the cold air. The truth clawed its way to the surface, undeniable and monstrous. There was no lion. There never had been. The signs, the sounds, the fear, it had all come from him. He stumbled back to the cabin, slamming the door behind him. The rifle lay forgotten as he sank into the corner, his head in his hands. The whispers in his mind grew louder, mocking him. He had spent weeks fighting a predator that didn't exist, circling the cabin, building traps, cooking the evidence. Eli sat there until dawn, his mind unraveling. When the morning light crept into the cabin, he stepped outside, his boots crunching in the snow. The clearing was still and silent, the woods bathed in golden light. He followed the faint tracks leading away from the cabin and stopped at the edge of the ravine. The wind tugged at his coat as he stared into the void. For a long time he stood there, his mind teetering on the edge. One step forward and it would all be over, but he stepped back. The days that followed were slow. He unbarricaded the windows, reset the traps, and rebuilt the cabin piece by piece. The journal remained on the desk, its pages filled with fragmented entries. One night he wrote a simple line. There was no lion. There never was. Just me. Spring came, the snow melting into streams that ran through the forest. One morning, Eli stood on the porch, his coffee steaming in the crisp air. He glanced toward the tree line, where the shadows shifted. For a moment, he thought he saw movement, a flicker of gold slipping between the trees. He smiled faintly, shaking his head. It was just the wind. Turning back inside, he shut the door behind him. The clearing remained still, untouched, and silent. Thank you for listening to this Campbound story. Please give us a thumbs up and hit subscribe.